Paul and barking dogs. He's talking about dogs. Let's look at Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through to 11. Watch out for those dogs, those men who do evil, those mutilators of the flesh. Chapter 3, verse 2. Now the Philippian church, being mostly Gentile in origin, was not troubled by Judaizers as much as the other churches that Paul had planted. But trouble followed Paul in these circumstances. And Paul's warning in Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through to verse 11, doesn't depart from this particular theme, because the essence of the Judaizers was that they put their own pride before the real needs of the people they were supporting, going to serve and going to educate. Them first, people second, wrong way around. And they are the negative example of all that Paul is trying to say. The Judaizers refused to understand what the Old Testament clearly taught, that Israel was set aside to serve the Gentiles, not to master them. It was never necessary for Gentile converts to be circumcised and to become Israelites. The Judaizers, however, wanted all Gentiles to be circumcised and tried to impose this on the Gentile church. Paul hated. He hated this attitude with a passion. He called the Judaizers dogs, which is the term that they used to use for Gentiles. So he just flips it around and throws it back at them. He said that their circumcision is actually mutilation, and a mutilated person could not serve as a priest according to the law of Leviticus chapter 21, verses 16 to 23. The Old Testament had finished and there was a period of grace. So what he's saying is these Judaizers had actually disqualified themselves from serving as priests to the true circumcision as called the church in verse 3. Paul again became his own example. As far as the flesh was concerned, he had it all. He was circumcised strictly according to the law on the 8th day. He had a perfect background, a genealogical background tracing right back to Benjamin. He had the best possible education in the law. He had zeal. He obeyed the customs perfectly in verse 4 through to verse 6. But all of this was rubbish compared to what he has now come to know in Christ in verse 8. And some scholars actually contend that the Greek word for rubbish is actually the ordinary slang term for dung, or may refer to garbage thrown out to dogs. This stuff had value before Christ, but now you flush it away. Christ is now the only thing that counts, and Paul put everything else away to the side and discarded it. His call was for them to imitate Paul, imitate Timothy, imitate Epaphroditus, and pay no attention to the barking dogs. Ignore them. And those who divert attention away from Christ are the enemy. And the same is true today as it was back then. That the church always has enemies who want to steal our affection away from our master and his service. And we wince when pastors sometimes warn us against enemies, but we should be grateful, because it's their job to warn us against the dogs and to encourage. You need to encourage your pastor today of Paul's faithfulness in this particular example.